Good morning. In this talk, I wish to depart a little from my main series and to speak about a writer who is not Greek but Syrian, and that is St. Isaac of Nineveh, who is better known in the Orthodox world as Isaac the Syrian. He lived in the 7th century, and his master theme is the all-embracing love of God. So, as title for this talk, let me take this: Isaac the Syrian, love without limits. Let me begin in an autobiographical way. I can vividly remember how I first came across St. Isaac the Syrian. It was during my university years. I was reading an anthology by Victor Gollancz called A Year of Grace. And in between a quotation by the Buddha and another from Spinoza, I came across a passage by St. Isaac about the merciful heart. Let me read it to you from a different translation. An elder was once asked, "What is a compassionate heart?" He replied, "It is a heart on fire for the whole of creation, for humanity, for the birds, for the animals, for demons, and for all that exists. At the recollection and at the sight of them, such a person's eyes overflow with tears, owing to the vehemence of the compassion which grips his heart. As a result of his deep mercy, his heart shrinks and cannot bear to hear or to look on any injury or the slightest suffering of anything in creation. That is why he continually offers up prayers full of tears, even for the irrational animals and for the enemies of truth, even for those who harm him, so that they may be protected and find mercy. He even prays for the reptiles as a result of the great compassion which is poured out beyond measure after the likeness of God in his heart." That passage on all-embracing love for the whole of creation, including the animals, including even the venomous and unattractive animals, the poisonous reptiles in the desert, including even the demons, gripped my imagination, and I've always remembered it ever since. And I asked myself, who is this Isaac who has such a keen sense of the love of God? Then, somewhat later on, reading that classic study by Vladimir Lossky, The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church, I came across a passage from Isaac about the nature of hell. Again, let me read it to you from a slightly different translation from that used by Lossky. "Even those who are scourged in hell are tormented with the scourging of love. the scourges that result from love, that is, the scourges of those who have become aware that they have sinned against love, are harder and more bitter than the torments which result from fear. The pain which gnaws the heart as the result of sinning against love is sharper than all other torments that there are. The power of love works in two ways. It torments those who have sinned, just as happens among friends here on earth. But to those who have observed its duties, love gives delight. So it is in Gehenna. The contrition that comes from love is the harsh torment. But in the case of the sons of heaven, delight in this love inebriates their souls. I thought then, and I still think today, that this is the only approach to hell that makes any sense. God's love is everywhere, even in hell. And God's love is unchanging. It is never altered into hatred. God does not punish those who are in hell. It is they who punish themselves by refusing to accept his love. As C.S. Lewis says, the doors of hell are locked on the inside. Hell is not a place where God imprisons us. It is a place where humans imprison themselves when they refuse God's love. Love, as Isaac says here, works in a double way. The saints who accept the love of God experience great joy. But what these saints experience as joy, the people who reject God experience as torment. The greatest suffering we can experience on earth is the knowledge that we have rejected the love of others and closed our hearts against their love. And that is what happens in hell. The sufferings in hell are precisely, as Isaac puts it, the scourgings of love, because those in hell suffer through their own free choice, because they will not love God. Again I asked myself, who is this Isaac who has such a deep perception of the meaning of hell? Then, a little later on, I came across an article about St. Isaac's view of the Incarnation. Isaac sets the Incarnation within the perspective of God's total purpose for his creation. He sees the Incarnation as supremely the expression of God's love. Note how this is a theme running through all St. Isaac's theology. The Incarnation is an expression of eternal love. It's not just God's solution to the problem of sin. Many Christian writers imply that if human beings had not fallen, then there would have been no reason for the Incarnation, no reason for God to become man. Isaac is dissatisfied with this. He says, the incarnation, God becoming in the closest possible way one of us by taking into himself our human nature. This is the most blessed and joyful thing that could possibly have happened to the human race. And are we to assign as the cause for this joyful happening something which ought never to have occurred, namely our fall into sin? Surely not, says Isaac. The incarnation is not just a contingency plan by God to deal with things when they've gone wrong. The incarnation is part of God's eternal purpose. God created the world so that his Son might become a human being within that world, without ceasing to be God. And so, for Isaac, even if there had not been a fall, there would still have been an incarnation. Of course, by and large, the fathers do not ask irrelevant questions. And the question, what would have happened if there had never been a fall, is an irrelevant question for us. A question, indeed, that we cannot properly answer, because the only situation we know, we humans, is that of a fallen world. However, Isaac looks beyond the perspective of sin and the way in which sin might be corrected. He looks to the primary purpose of God in creating the world. God created the world so that he and his creation could share in love and in joyfulness. And the incarnation is the deepest and fullest expression of this sharing, this joyfulness. And so, says Isaac, it is part of God's eternal purpose. The purpose of the incarnation, as he puts it, is simply that the world should feel the love that God had towards creation. Are we to suppose, he asks, that had there been no fall, men and angels would have been deprived of all this light and joy? Who then is this Isaac, who writes in such a perceptive way about the loving kindness of God? He belonged to the Church of the East. This is the church that existed in the period of the later Roman Empire and the early Byzantine era in basically what today is Persia and Iraq. This church is often called Nestorian, and in the past it used to be regarded by Byzantine Orthodox and Eastern Catholics and Roman Catholics, and for that matter Anglicans, as a heretical church. But in fact, it is not heretical, and it does not specially rely on the teaching of Nestorius. It is far more indebted to Theodore of Mopsuestia. It continues the tradition of the school of Antioch. Yes, this tradition of the school of Antioch stresses with considerable emphasis the distinction between God and manhood in Christ, the distinction between the two natures. But that does not mean it divides Christ into two. In fact, when Isaac was translated into Greek and then into Slavonic, the Byzantine and Russian Christians who were reading him had no idea he belonged to the Church of the East. But this is now established. It does not mean, however, that we should set Isaac aside. We can regard him as a father of the Church. We don't know very much about his life. He lived in the second half of the 7th century. He lived in the area of the Persian Gulf. He was born in Qatar, the area in northeast of Saudi Arabia. He was Syrian in his language. I don't know if he knew Greek, possibly not, but much Greek Christian literature was available in Syria. He became a monk in one of the many monasteries in northern Iraq, and around the 670s he became Bishop of Nineveh, though he resigned after, so it is thought, only 5 months, and retired to be a hermit in the mountains of what is now southwest Iran, dying about the year 700. Let us look then at his teaching. His central and unifying theme is the primacy of love. But while this runs through all his teaching, he is not systematic. I do not want to count milestones, he says, but to enter the marriage chamber. He does distinguish various stages in the Christian life, but they are not marked out in such a clear and sharp way as they are, for example, in Evagrius of Pontus. The first thing that strikes us in Isaac is he has a holistic view of the human person. He sees the human being as a unity of body and soul. And therefore he insists that our body should play an active role in the spiritual life. We should not relate only to God through our mind, but through the totality of ourselves. He writes, "Every prayer in which the body does not participate is to be reckoned an abortion." And one way in which the body participates in the spiritual life, of which Isaac has much to say, is the gift of tears. Spiritual tears are a major theme in his teaching. An interesting point to note in passing is that Isaac says that wandering thoughts during prayer are not always bad. Most spiritual teachers have a great deal to say about distractions and about maintaining with continuity our attention upon our prayer, upon the central themes of our faith in God. And so again and again, when people come to see me to talk about prayer, what they have to say is, I find it very difficult to concentrate. My thoughts keep wandering. What can I do to ensure continuity of attentiveness. Well, Isaac takes a rather merciful view of this. He says that wandering thoughts are not always negative, that there is a good wandering when we let our mind dwell freely on the wonders of God. So he does not want us in our prayer to be always grim and tense. He would say, relax, dwell in the beauty and the marvels of the divine realm. Let your mind wander on that if you suffer from distractions. Let's look more carefully at Isaac's understanding of divine love. We've already seen how the incarnation is to be seen as expressing God's eternal love for his creation, not simply as the answer to sin. And we've already seen how for Isaac, even in hell, people are not deprived of the love of God. God goes on loving them. For Isaac, God's justice is to be understood in terms of his love. The atonement, reconciliation of humankind to God, is inexplicable in terms of justice. How could there be justice in God, asks Isaac, when Christ died for us while we were sinners? It is blasphemous, says Isaac, to imagine that there is in God any desire for vengeance or retribution. It would be most odious, he says, and utterly blasphemous to think that hate and resentment exists with God, even against demonic beings, or to imagine any other weakness or passibility or whatever else might be involved in the course of retribution of good and bad, as applying in a retributive way to that glorious nature. Rather, he acts towards us in ways he knows will be advantageous to us, whether by way of things that cause suffering or by way of things that cause relief, whether they cause joy or grief, whether they are insignificant or glorious, all are directed to the single eternal good. So, we must never imagine that God acts in a vindictive or punitive way. How many people, in fact, when they think of God, see him as someone who punishes us, who's trying to catch us out, and then will pounce on us? Isaac rebels against this kind of approach. God is love. He may, in fact, punish us, yes, in the sense that he may allow us to suffer. But always his purpose is that we may be purified, that we may be brought back to our true nature. What seem to be punishments from God have always a positive purpose, not to cause us to suffer as an end in itself, but to help us through suffering to enter once more into the fullness of life. All the apparent punishments from God, then, have an affirmative purpose. All are an expression of his love. But love has its demands. Love asks things from us. This we know in our human relations. Falling in love with another person is a serious thing to do. And so it is also with God. But God's justice, this is Isaac's basic point, is always to be understood in terms of his love. And what may seem to be the wrath of God, and Scripture speaks of that, this is in fact his love, reaching out towards us to bring us home. Isaac underlines that divine love is something beyond our understanding. He is very strongly an apophatic theologian. He believes, as someone like Gregory of Nyssa believed very strongly, that God is beyond our understanding. God reveals himself to us in Christ. But even in that revelation, even in the incarnate life of Christ, there is so much that is beyond the grasp of our human comprehension. And so, a master theme in Isaac is the idea of wonder, of astonishment before the mystery of God. He urges, in terms similar to those of Evagrius, whom he'd certainly read, that we should pass beyond the reasoning brain, beyond a discursive argumentation through syllogisms, beyond the abstract intellectual concepts that we form with our human understanding. He urges us to rise beyond that to what he calls unified simplicity, a simple gazing upon God, a simple dwelling in his presence, beyond words, beyond rational concepts. But he recognizes that in this world, love goes hand in hand with suffering. Isaac has frequent passages upon the need to follow Christ on the way of the cross. Sometimes people make a contrast between the Christian West and the Christian East, and they say the Christian East emphasizes the resurrection and the Christian West the crucifixion. This is an oversimplification so great that it is really a falsehood. East and West may have different ways of understanding the cross and the resurrection, but both the East and the West emphasize these two things, cross and resurrection, together. And certainly in the East there is a strong emphasis upon the place of cross-bearing in the Christian life. And that is one of the themes that we find in Isaac. God's love for us is expressed through the cross. Our love for him is expressed through prosperity. For Isaac, divine love is inexhaustible. And this leads him to hope for the ultimate salvation of all. God, he says, is not one who requites evil, but he sets evil aright. Isaac admits that there is a deep mystery here, and he speaks with caution. But such is his faith in the power of love that he believes in the end God's love will be triumphant. Now here, of course, we are speaking of things which at this present moment we can understand only to a very limited degree. Our comprehension cannot reach out to the ultimate plan of God for the created order. But Isaac will not rest satisfied with an ultimate dualism. A writer of the early 3rd century, the first Latin Christian writer, Tertullian, said, "The joy of those in heaven will be increased when they look down and see the torments of those in hell." Isaac will have nothing of this. He cannot rest satisfied with the idea that the great majority of the human race will end up in everlasting torment. He cannot rest satisfied with the idea of a God who says to his creation, "All right, you've had your chance. You're not going to get another one. Get out." God, he says, is not like that. God's love will never change to hatred. God's affirmation of his creation will never change into a rejection. God could never rest satisfied with a situation where the great majority of the beings whom he had made for joy and love are cut off eternally in desperate suffering. Surely, says Isaac, God will seek to overcome this. Yes, we are faced here with a dilemma. We want to affirm two things. The first is God is love. The second is human beings are free. God is love. His love is inexhaustible. His love will never change to hatred. He will go on forever, loving everything that he has made. But he has given us the gift of freedom. As it says in the letter to Diognetus of the 2nd century, God persuades, he does not compel, for violence is foreign to him. A golden saying. I wish Christians through the centuries had applied it to themselves. As Father Sergei Bulgakov, a great Russian theologian of the 20th century, says, God convinces, he does not coerce. And Paul Evdokimov, another Russian theologian of the 20th century, says, with deliberate paradox, God can do anything except compel us to love him. Because love implies freedom. And where people act under compulsion, there is no love. We cannot force people to love us. and not even God can do that. But God will go on loving us, where we can go on saying no. Isaac wrestles with this problem, but he believes that God will have some marvelous plan, which we do not understand at the present moment, but which will somehow bring about a final reconciliation. He writes, "It is not the way of the compassionate Creator to make rational beings in order to deliver them over mercilessly to unending affliction." There is a story told of the Athonite monk Saint Silouan, who died in 1938. One day in the Russian monastery on the Holy Mountain, a hermit came in for the meal and said with evident satisfaction, "God will punish all atheists. They will burn forever in hell." And Saint Silouan said, perhaps recalling Tertullian, "Tell me, Father, if you were in heaven and saw them suffering in hell, wouldn't you feel sorry for them?" "No," said the hermit, "it can't be helped. It would be their own fault." And Saint Silouan said, with deep grief and compassion, love could not bear that. This is also the position of St. Isaac. We do not know the ultimate purpose of God for his creation. This is a mystery far beyond us at the present moment. But we can affirm the love of God. Surely God's love will prevail. Surely there will come a time when, in the words of St. Paul, God is all in all. Incidentally, Origen and Evagrius and Gregory of Nyssa, like Isaac, all believed that there would be an ultimate reconciliation, that there would be, in God's eternal providence, a final gathering together of all things and all creatures in love. Universal salvation. Origen and Evagrius were condemned for saying this at or around the time of the Fifth Ecumenical Council in 553. Gregory of Nyssa, though he says quite clearly that he believes the devil will in the end be saved, has never been condemned for that. Isaac says the same. All four of them speak with humility, accepting the divine mystery. But all four of them are concerned to affirm the primacy of love, love without limits. There exists, says Isaac, with reference to God, there exists in him a single love and compassion which is spread over all creation, a love which is without alteration, timeless and everlasting. No part belonging to any single one of all rational beings will be lost. Elsewhere he writes, "Among all his actions there is none which is not entirely a matter of mercy, of love and compassion. This constitutes the beginning and the end of all his dealings with us. And yet again he says, far be it that vengeance could ever be found in the fountain of love and ocean brimming with goodness. As a grain of sand cannot counterbalance a great quantity of gold, so, in comparison, God's use of justice cannot counterbalance his mercy. One final point about St. Isaac. Since God is infinite, since his love is inexhaustible, even in heaven the saints never cease to make further progress. So Isaac agrees with St. Gregory of Nyssa that even in heaven we never cease to advance from glory to glory. As Isaac puts it, the course of wisdom is without end. Thank you.